Episode 1 began with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and uncertainty. The narrator had agreed to spend a full day with people who had lived a life of crime, but nothing could prepare them for the raw reality. As the sun rose, the atmosphere felt heavy, almost as if the streets whispered stories of betrayal, survival, and regret. The first meeting was arranged in a small, dimly lit room in a halfway house where former gang members gathered. Their eyes carried the weight of countless unspoken experiences, and their posture revealed lives hardened by both violence and consequence. One man, tall and quiet, broke the silence first. He admitted to having spent most of his youth behind bars, joining gangs as a teenager because the streets offered more loyalty than his own home. His voice was steady but hollow, showing that years of crime had stripped him of something deeper than freedom. It had taken away his sense of innocence. As conversations continued, the narrator realized that these men were not one-dimensional villains. Each had a story woven with pain, poor choices, and missed chances. Another man shared how poverty pushed him toward theft, not for luxury but for survival. His first crime was stealing food for his siblings, which eventually spiraled into a habit that defined his teenage years. When asked whether he felt regret, his eyes softened. He admitted that regret was something he lived with daily, a silent companion that never left him, even when laughter filled the room. The group laughed often, joking about prison food or the absurdity of old street rivalries, but beneath that humor was a lingering awareness of lives wasted. The narrator listened carefully, feeling the contrast between the humanity in front of them and the stereotype of criminals that society painted. It became clear that the first lesson was not about crime itself but about the humanity hidden within those who committed it. As evening arrived, the experience grew more intense. The group took the narrator through parts of the city where their stories began. Graffiti-covered walls and broken streetlights served as reminders of battles once fought. The men pointed out corners where they used to sell drugs, alleys where fights broke out, and abandoned houses where they once hid from police. Every location carried a piece of history, and with every step, the narrator's understanding deepened. The streets felt alive with ghosts of decisions, both proud and shameful. By the end of the night, fatigue set in, but so did reflection. The first episode ended with the realization that behind every crime was a human story, shaped by pain, need, and choices that could have been different if life had offered them another path. Episode 2 started with a very different tone. Instead of simply listening to stories, the narrator spent the day observing the men in their present lives. Now out of prison, many of them struggled with rebuilding their identities. The morning began in a workshop where a few were learning trades, carpentry, welding, and basic mechanics. Their hands, once used for destructive purposes, were now shaping wood into furniture and repairing broken machines. Watching them work was almost symbolic. Men once broken were slowly trying to repair themselves piece by piece. One former gang leader admitted that learning a skill gave him more peace than anything he had ever done on the streets. The pride in his eyes when he showed a finished wooden chair was unlike the pride he once had in winning a fight or making money illegally. Later in the day, the group joined a community outreach program. Here, they spoke to troubled teenagers who were on the edge of falling into crime themselves. The narrator watched closely as these men, who once lived reckless lives, now used their voices to warn others not to repeat their mistakes. Their words were raw and unpolished, but they carried weight because they were spoken from experience. One young boy asked, "Did prison change you?" The response was immediate and firm. "Prison didn't change me. It broke me. Change only came when I realized I didn't want my son to grow up thinking I was nothing but a criminal." That honesty left the room silent. The evening of the second episode closed with laughter around a shared meal. It was simple food, but it felt like a celebration of survival. These men were no longer defined by the crimes they committed, though the scars would always remain. Spending time with them revealed not only their broken past but also their determination to build a better future. For the narrator, the biggest lesson from the second episode was that redemption is possible, but it requires both courage and support. The day ended with gratitude, not only for the stories shared but for the chance to see the strength it takes to rebuild a life once shattered by crime. Episode 3 opened with a sense of tension. The narrator had already seen how these men lived now, but the next step was to witness the hidden struggles that most people never see. The day began in a cramped apartment where one of the men, Marcus, lived with his younger brother. The walls were bare, the furniture secondhand, and the fridge half empty. Marcus admitted that after prison, finding steady work was almost impossible. Every job application asked about his criminal record, and every rejection reminded him of his past. He confessed that temptation often lurked close by. Old friends from the streets still called him, offering easy money and fast solutions. As he spoke, his phone buzzed with messages he ignored, but the weight of that choice was visible on his face. Choosing the right path meant living with constant hunger, both literal and emotional. Later that day, the narrator accompanied Marcus and two others to a support group meeting. In the circle sat men and women who had walked similar roads: drug dealing, armed robbery, gang wars. Each took turns sharing the battles they fought daily, not with police or rivals, but with themselves. One man admitted that he couldn't walk past a liquor store without feeling the urge to steal. Another woman confessed she hadn't spoken to her mother in 10 years because shame kept her away. The air was heavy, but there was also a sense of solidarity. No one judged, because everyone carried the same burden of regret. The narrator realized this was not just about survival outside prison walls, it was about surviving the prison inside their own minds. In the afternoon, the group visited a mural painted in honor of those lost to street violence. Names were scrawled across the wall, some vibrant with color, others faded with time. Marcus pointed to a name and whispered that it belonged to his childhood friend, a boy he once played ball with on the very same street. That friend had died in a shootout before turning 20. Standing there, the narrator could feel the silence of grief that still lingered. The men stared at the wall not just as a memorial but as a warning. Every name could have easily been theirs. The evening ended with the narrator walking back through the city alone, carrying the realization that crime was not just an act but a cycle, one that left scars long after the sentence was served. Episode 4 shifted the perspective. Instead of focusing only on the criminals, the narrator explored how their choices affected families and communities. The day began with a visit to a woman named Rosa, the sister of one of the men in the group. She had lived through the chaos of having a brother in and out of jail. Rosa described the nights she couldn't sleep, waiting for a call that her brother was either arrested or dead. She admitted that while she loved him, she also resented the years he left her to care for their mother alone. Her story revealed the ripple effect of crime, how one decision could weigh on entire families. Listening to her, the narrator understood that while redemption was possible for the men, forgiveness was a much harder road for the people they had hurt. Later in the afternoon, the group visited a neighborhood school where some of the men volunteered. They spoke to children about choices, responsibility, and consequences. The narrator watched as wide-eyed students listened to stories of prison life. One man held up his hands and showed the scars from fights and shackles, warning the children that these marks were permanent reminders of bad decisions. The silence in the classroom showed that the message was hitting home. For the narrator, it was powerful to see men once feared now working to protect a younger generation from repeating their paths. The evening brought a quiet moment of reflection. The narrator sat with the group in a small park, watching children play while the men exchanged quiet words about their futures. Some dreamed of starting businesses, others of reconnecting with their families. One said he just wanted to live long enough to see his daughter graduate high school. It was a simple wish, but it carried the weight of someone who had seen death too closely. The narrator realized that episode 4 was not only about crime but about hope. Despite the shadows of their past, these men carried a fragile but determined desire to live differently. By the end of the day, the lesson was clear: crime may define a chapter of someone's life, but it doesn't have to be the ending. The families still hurt, the communities still scarred, but change was possible if the courage to choose it remained stronger than the pull of the past. The narrator walked away with a new respect for both the resilience of the men and the quiet strength of those who loved them, even after the darkest mistakes. Episode 5 began before sunrise, when the city streets were still half asleep but the narrator was already awake, waiting for another intense day. This time the focus was on the hidden dangers of falling back into crime, the thin line between staying clean and being dragged into the same cycle again. The narrator joined two men, Tony and Malik, as they traveled across the city for a day of temporary labor work. They left home with empty stomachs, carrying only a small bag with work gloves and water bottles. On the bus ride, Malik explained how difficult it was to find permanent employment. Every company asked questions about their past, and most never called back. That rejection left them with only one option: short-term work that paid little but at least kept them busy. The ride was filled with silence, the kind of silence that comes from men constantly fighting battles no one else sees. When they arrived at the construction site, it became clear how much they valued the opportunity, no matter how exhausting. Tony, sweating under the morning sun, said that carrying bricks and mixing cement felt like freedom compared to the weight of prison walls. "At least now, every drop of sweat belongs to me," he said. The narrator noticed the pride in his tone, but also the exhaustion that came from working harder than most just to be treated as equal. By noon, their bodies were aching, but there was no room for complaints. Survival demanded endurance. In the afternoon, a different test emerged. On their way back, they passed through an old neighborhood where both Tony and Malik once sold drugs. A group of familiar faces waved from a street corner, offering greetings and sly invitations. It was a dangerous moment, like standing on the edge of a cliff. Malik's jaw tightened as he looked away, whispering, "That life's still waiting for me if I let it." The narrator felt the heaviness of that choice. Walking past temptation was harder than any physical labor they had done earlier. The bus ride home carried an air of relief, but also the understanding that this battle would repeat every single day. Episode 5 ended with a simple truth. Escaping crime was not about one big decision, but about countless small choices, made over and over again, even when no one was watching. Episode 6 began in a very different atmosphere. Instead of construction sites and temptations, the narrator joined the men during a community event organized by a local nonprofit. Families gathered in a park, food was being served, and music filled the air. At first glance, it looked like any ordinary celebration, but for the men, this event was proof of how far they had come. Some were serving food to children, others were helping set up games. Their tattoos and scars, once symbols of fear, now made them approachable to the youth who listened closely to their advice. The narrator noticed how naturally they blended into the environment, showing that change wasn't just a dream, it was something visible and real. During the afternoon, the narrator sat down with several men to talk about forgiveness. They spoke not of forgiving others, but of forgiving themselves. One said that every time he saw his mother's tears, he felt the weight of his past crimes all over again. Another admitted that he sometimes woke up from nightmares of prison fights, his body tense as if he were still behind bars. Forgiveness, they explained, wasn't about pretending the past never happened. It was about learning to live with it without letting it destroy the future. Their words carried the depth of people who had walked through fire and survived. Later in the evening, the group gathered near the edge of the park as the sun went down. Children ran around playing tag while parents laughed in the background. Watching that scene, one man whispered, "This is what we fought for, another chance to live like everyone else." The narrator realized how powerful that statement was. These men weren't chasing riches or fame. They simply wanted normalcy, the simple joys of peace, safety, and family. The night closed with everyone sitting together, sharing food and quiet conversations. The narrator reflected on everything learned so far. Crime was not just an act but a storm that damaged everyone it touched. Yet within that storm were people capable of change, people who carried both the weight of their mistakes and the courage to try again. Episode 6 ended not with drama or danger, but with the soft, steady light of hope, proof that even in the harshest lives, redemption could take root if given the chance.